If you haven't been watching AFCON, I honestly feel for you, as you've deprived yourself of one of the most entertaining tournaments in recent memory. Moments of brilliance on the pitch, moments of madness off of it, a record amount of goals scored in the tournament, and too many upsets to count. And by the end of this video, I'll have told you the tale of one of the greatest tournament comebacks, a turnaround of epic proportions, time and time again. But what about some other details from this AFCON? You had Ghana, one of the favorites, eliminated in the group stage as they weren't even one of the best third place teams. As things stand, Equatorial Guinea's Emilio Nsue could yet end up as the tournament's top scorer, a guy who played much of his career as a right back and currently swaps between right back and striker for Intercity CF, who plays in the third tier of Spanish football. Then you had nations like Mauritania eliminating the 2019 champions Algeria in the group stage, or Bebe's Cape Verde looking excellent all tournament, but falling to South Africa in a shootout as their keeper, Ronwen Williams, saved 4 penalties. Not long before the tournament, just 3 months prior actually, Nigeria wanted to sack their Portuguese manager José Peseiro, but couldn't, and now they're in the final and looking dangerous. And the team they are playing in the final, the hosts, Ivory Coast, well, an entire documentary needs to be made on their journey, which has been insane from the start. Hey, I'm Adrian and welcome to Rabona TV. Like I said in a previous video, I wanted to profile one of the AFCON stories that I thought was incredible. On the short list were Cape Verde, South Africa, DR Congo, and the Ivory Coast. And with the former 3 eliminated, we go with the Ivory Coast. And honestly, their story and how it has developed from the beginning of the tournament to now is totally worthy. Like I said, a documentary needs to be made. Ivory Coast certainly came into this tournament as one of the favorites, not the favorite, but one of them, as the likes of Nigeria, Senegal, Egypt, and Morocco were all ahead of them when people were speaking of potential winners. They were perhaps closer to being called a dark horse than a favorite, as I think an Al Jazeera article I read pre-tournament put them. But given they were the host nation, with rocking support at each match and a very talented squad, you can never count them out, right? Speaking of which, the first match went swimmingly for the hosts, with Ivory Coast winning 2-0 over Guinea-Bissau. I mean, check out this lineup. There's quality everywhere, no? Franck Kessié, Seko Fofana, and Ibrahim Sangare is quite the midfield. That back line is fantastic, and the attack of Jonathan Bamba, JP Crasso, and Jeremy Boga is pretty scary as well. However, Jean-Louis Gasset, the manager, made a couple of changes in the next match, and Ivory Coast lost 1-0 to Nigeria due to a penalty that Trusty Khan converted. Not a disaster just yet. But the match against Equatorial Guinea, or E-Guinea, not E-Girls, but E-Guinea, that was indeed a disaster. Despite dominating the match, I'm talking having close to 70% possession and outshooting E-Guinea 7-2 in the first half, Emilio Nsue put E-Guinea ahead in the 42nd minute. After the half, Ivory Coast looked to have regrouped, and they began dominating E-Guinea even more than the first half, but they couldn't find their equalizer despite having 2 goals disallowed since E-Guinea's opener. In fact, about 30 minutes into the second half, E-Guinea was 2-0 up. 2 minutes after that, and Nsue had scored his second of the match and E-Guinea's third. By the 88th minute, E-Guinea were beating the hosts 4-0. 4-0! And it looked like Les Elephants' tournament was over after 2 consecutive losses in the group stage. There had to be consequences for this, right? As it looked as if the hosts would be out of the tournament. Sure enough, Gasset was sacked 2 days later on the final day of group stage matches, as it seemed like the journey for Les Elephants was ending in shame. Well, like many international tournaments these days, the 4 best third place teams from the group stage would move on to the next round of the African Cup of Nations, meaning as long as you weren't one of the 2 worst third place teams, you would move on. Pretty good odds, honestly. The 2 teams that were in contention to make it as the final third place side were Zambia and Ivory Coast. With Ivory Coast having lost already, their eyes were on the Zambia versus Morocco match on January 24th, with Zambia needing just a draw to advance. In the 37th minute, Hakim Ziyech put Morocco ahead, leading to another hour of torturous football for the host Ivory Coast to watch. While there were a couple of close calls, Morocco held on to win 1-0, eliminate Zambia, and see Ivory Coast scrape by as the fourth best third place team. The final ticket on the train, man. As you would expect, the Ivorians were incredibly thankful to the Moroccans as they paraded alongside the Moroccan bus after the match, as documented on TikTok by Sofiane Amrabat. So, Ivory Coast were saved, but they didn't have a manager, as Gasset was sacked earlier that same day, remember? He was sacked in the morning, afternoon, whatever. And Morocco beat Zambia in that evening. So Ivory Coast scrambled to hire a manager right away as they bet their future on their past in trying to hire Hervé Renard on loan, despite him being the coach of the France women's national team. Renard, of course, won the tournament with Ivory Coast back in 2015. And so, who came into the picture? Interim coach Emers Faye, the man who played for Ivory Coast in the 2006 edition, including in the finals shootout loss to Egypt on penalties. And he couldn't have asked for a more difficult round of 16 match to take on, as Ivory Coast had to navigate their way past none other than defending champion Senegal, who won all 3 of their group stage matches against Cameroon, Gambia, and Guinea. Faye made changes to a much more defensive shape, adopting more of a 4-4-2 over the 4-3-3 that they had played with for ages, and he dropped Kessié to the bench. They were already losing after 4 minutes. Ah, man, you can imagine the reaction and how the squad felt. They must have felt like it would be a long day ahead of them, but after fighting hard, getting some decent chances for themselves, but ultimately getting outplayed by Senegal, 2 of Faye's substitutes in Pepe and Kessié started to carve out solid opportunities. And if it weren't for Edouard Mendy, maybe they would have scored. Finally, in the 83rd minute, Pepe won a penalty and Kessié converted. The Ivory Coast would go 5 for 5 in the shootout, while Senegal's Niakate's miss would cost the defending champions. Ivory Coast survive again. Next up, Mali. And that early bad luck struck again, man. Poor Faye. The pressure on this man and the absolute dirt that was getting piled upon him. A yellow for Kusunu, a penalty for Mali, and thankfully for Ivory Coast, Fofana made a fantastic save to keep it level. Kusunu, however, wanted to up the difficulty a little more for Ivory Coast and got himself sent off for a silly foul when his teammate had the attack covered. Poor Faye. You see what I mean, man? Nene Dorgeles would put Mali ahead in the second half. Funnily enough, Nene was actually born in the Ivory Coast. How do Ivory Coast escape from this now? Well, they're down a goal. They're down a man. The crowd is completely deflated. But in the 90th minute, Simon Adingra picks up a loose ball in the box and equalizes for Ivory Coast. Extra time beckons. And it gets better because, of course it does. After equalizing in the final minute of regulation, they then play through extra time. And of course, they then win the match. A man down since the end of the first half, and from a Seko Fofana strike at the edge of the box, Oumar Diakite's touch guided the ball past Diarra in the 121st minute of extra time. Everyone was already writing down their penalty takers, but once again, clutch Ivory Coast come through. Ivory Coast survive again. Now, the semifinal was against DR Congo, a very good side in this tournament, but at this point, Faye's Ivory Coast team are united. The country believes they will somehow win every match through divine intervention, luck, or just a sheer unwillingness to lose at any cost. But in reality, Ivory Coast are starting to play much, much better as the tournament rolls on. So despite playing a very good opposition, Faye's side are also a well-oiled machine at this point. The midfield in particular of Seri, Kessié, and Fofana locks Congo out. And if they do get through, Ndika and Boli are there to stop them. These guys are tempered in the flames after the tournament they've had. They're solid now. What was miraculous about this match, however, was the goal that Haller scored, and what a moment for the guy who only recently was fighting cancer, as you'll remember. Ask him to replicate that goal, and 9 times out of 10 he'd be unable to. His volley was struck into the ground, then looped over the keeper and into the far corner. While the match didn't have that drama that the previous 2 rounds did, it still had that bit of magic to it that just comes with these Ivory Coast matches. And just think back on everything that has happened in this tournament. A great start for the hosts of the tournament, followed by 2 group stage losses. They assume they are eliminated, so they sack their manager. Morocco saves them in beating Zambia. They fail in getting Renard in on a short-term basis as their manager, so they go with interim manager in Faye. They overcome the defending champions in a shootout. They play with 10 men against Mali for about 75 minutes, only to beat them with a last-minute winner in extra time. Then they beat DR Congo and make it look relatively routine. And now they face Nigeria, another team that has grown in stature as the tournament has progressed, in what will no doubt be an incredible way to end this tournament. And hey, knowing Ivory Coast and how finals go for them, don't be surprised if it goes to a shootout, as they have gone to a shootout in every other final they have made in this tournament. 1992, 2006, 2012, and 2015, winning 2 and losing 2. Honestly, guys, this tournament has been a blast to watch, and Ivory Coast's story is legendary. Win or lose, it's legendary. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then do leave a like below to let the algorithm know. Beyond that, I'm Adrian, and have a great day. Ciao.